She could have sworn she heard a muffled "help" with no exclamation point, and it sounded as if it came from inside Mr. Ellerton's office. She tried the knob, and the door opened. Her gaze fanned over the room, especially to the room's other door, which she thought had closed just as hers opened. The middle-aged librarian sat behind his desk, the back of his chair facing her. "Mr. Ellerton?" This was answered by a groan. Her first thought was that he'd suffered a heart attack. She fairly flew around the desk, only to be greeted by the most gruesome sight she had ever seen. Blood spilled across Mr. Ellerton's white shirt and beige sweater vest, and there in the center of his chest, a shiny gold dagger protruded. Antonia froze in her stride and screamed. It was pretty much the kind of scream reserved for axe murderers, or axed murderees. She hoped like hell it would summon help. Clearly, Mr. Ellerton was dying, his pudgy hands clasped around the dagger as if he were trying to remove it, but his waning strength was not up to such a demand. She must help. Tears stung her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Ellerton, what happened?" She would rather gawk at the bloody knife than his contorted face, which was what she did as she grabbed the knife and yanked it from his chest. "Shit," he muttered. Honestly, she could not in her wildest dreams imagine the mild-mannered librarian issuing such foul language, but she supposed this situation did merit such a curse word. As distasteful as it was to her, she moved closer to him, softening her voice. "Who did this to you?" Though he appeared to be looking right into her eyes, she knew he was not, because his gaze could not follow movement. "Shit," he ground out once more. Then he slumped. "Oh my God, he's dead." She had never been entirely proficient at taking her own pulse, so she knew she likely wouldn't succeed with one she judged to be really dead, but she was curious to know if he was beyond help, or not. And why hadn't someone come to help her? Where was that inept assistant, Alistair? She would scream again for good measure. Given the state of her frazzled nerves, such a scream came effortlessly. Just as she was eyeing the telephone on Mr. Ellerton's desk, Alistair came flying into the room. "What's happened?" His gaze ricocheted from her to his boss, and his eyes rounded. "What have you done to him?" That was the most assertive thing she'd heard the lisping wuss say in the 2 days she'd been around him. Why the fellow had been hired in the first place was a perfect mystery to her. Granted, he looked like he belonged in a library. He was no taller than her 5'7" height, perfectly pale and thin, and he wore glasses. Not exactly Antonio Banderas. He was even younger than her 23 years. Once again, she could barely contain her impatience with the bumbler. "I'm trying to see if we can save him. Can you check his pulse? Or better yet, can you call an ambulance?" Staring at her with horror, he did not move for a few seconds. "I swear, I'm not the one who stabbed him. I found him like this, only with the dagger in his chest." She peered at her now bloody hand, the dagger still clasped in it. It was only with the greatest restraint she refrained from threatening Alistair with the murder weapon. His gaze flicked to the wall above her head. Mounted behind Ellerton's desk was an assortment of antique swords and daggers, and one of them was missing. The young assistant snapped into action and came to feel for a pulse. A moment later, he looked up, his face solemn, and shook his head. "I suppose I'd better ring the police." This was one of those infrequent days when one could drive in England with the top down, which is exactly what Frederick Percy, the 13th Earl of Rockford, was doing. He was in uncommonly good humor, no doubt owing to the mild temperatures and clear blue skies. The sun was especially welcome after the previous night's relentless drizzle. Another reason for his good humor